Welcome to lesson number 19. This one's titled, Henry Ford almost invented Bitcoin in 1921, or Bitcoin is the real energy currency, or something like that. Bitcoin is the energy currency that Henry Ford wanted. So back in 1921, Henry Ford came up with an idea for an energy currency. And I'm going to bring up the article here in just a sec. But his big idea was that he wanted to end the centralization. He knew that gold wasn't going to cut it. And so he wanted to end the centralization that gold requires, trust. And his plan was to actually use an energy currency to end wars. That was his big idea. And I'm going to show you the newspaper article here from 1921. And we're going to talk about today why it failed. So here it is right here. Look at that. We got a couple different articles comparing it to Bitcoin. Ford predicted Bitcoin. So here's the article. We'll take a little bit of a zoom here. So it says Ford would replace gold with an energy currency and stop wars. So he said, declares if the government will give him Muscle Shoals plant, he can demonstrate success of a plan to substitute natural wealth. That's the key, natural wealth. Why? Because energy is natural. That's how the universe works. Bitcoin, energy currency, they're very much in line with nature. Because I'm sure we've all heard the law of the conservation of energy, which says that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. And a couple weeks ago, one of the lessons we did, the Bitcoin post office, is I explained why Bitcoin actually fits into that model. Bitcoin is in line with nature in that sense, that is natural. So natural wealth as a basis of the world's money. So again, this was in 1912. I know it's cut off there, but it's 1921. 1921, Henry Ford, who at the time, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, these were the big boys. These were like the Elon Musks of the time, maybe even bigger than that, honestly. Maybe even bigger than Elon Musk, but that's who it was. It was Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, and they introduced this idea of an energy currency. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about Bitcoin is the energy currency that Henry Ford wanted. We're going to talk about the timeline of what happened, the important numbers in Bitcoin, the importance of a predictable supply, the flaws of the energy currency back in 1921 and why it never could have worked, and why Bitcoin also probably would have failed before 2009. And then, of course, why Bitcoin works today. So this is going to be a fun one because, again, this kind of goes in line with if you can understand the difficulty adjustment and the importance of it and why it makes Bitcoin so valuable, then you have a pretty good understanding of Bitcoin. And I think once you have a good understanding of Bitcoin, then you're much less affected by the volatility of it, right? Because when you zoom out, when you look at like the 4-year moving average of Bitcoin, it just goes up. That's all it is. But there's a bunch of volatility in between there. And so when you have a good understanding and a good conviction over Bitcoin, then you're much less affected by those swings. And you can actually take advantage of them. So this information's critical, I would say, to your understanding of Bitcoin. So let's take a look at the timeline here. So 1912, what happened in 1912? The Titanic hit an iceberg. And why is that relevant? Well, the following year, the Federal Reserve was created on Jekyll Island. I don't know if that's how you spelled Jekyll, but it looks right. So I'm not going to get too much into the details here, especially, but if you got some time today, I want you to look up a couple things. Who wasn't on the Titanic? Who was supposed to be on the Titanic, but bailed last second, conveniently bailed last second? And you're going to be surprised because only a year later, the Federal Reserve was created, Jekyll Island, which basically gave a small group of people the license to print money. And the world hasn't been the same since then. The world hasn't been the same since 1913. This is pretty much when everything went to shit. A lot of people think it was 1971, but it was actually well before that. And there's a couple different things that happened along the way. And I guess we should probably put 1971 on here. But Stretch says Rockefeller. Yeah, it was probably somebody more important than Rockefeller. They have a pretty big bank in the US. You might have heard of them. Jamie Dimon's their current CEO. So I'm a conspiracy theorist myself. And it's funny because I was talking, you know what we're going to do actually? You know what we're going to do? We're going to do something right now. And I don't know what the implications of this will be, but frankly, I don't really give a shit. So we're actually going to walk through this together. How about that? We don't have to play any guessing games. We're going to actually get it straight from the horse's mouth. Okay, so let's just take it. Let's ease into this. What year did the Titanic sink? We're going to have a full conversation here, and we're going to get the information. So the RMS Titanic sank in 1912. It struck an iceberg April 14th and fully sank on April 15th. Okay, so who was supposed to be? No, let's ask this. Let's ask this one. Was J.P. Morgan on the Titanic, or was he supposed to be? J.P. Morgan was not on the Titanic. He owned the International Mercantile Marine Company, which controlled the White Star Line. I didn't even know that part of it. He owned the International Mercantile Marine Company, which controlled White Star Line and thus the Titanic. But he canceled his planned voyage at the last minute due to illness. How interesting is that? Due to last minute and stayed at a French resort. Rumors of a booking exist, but there's no solid proof he was ever confirmed. Oh, okay. So why did he bail at the last second then? Conspiracy theories claiming he orchestrated the sinking are widely debunked. Are they? Okay. Interesting. So that's what it was. And they didn't even really try to hide it either. Like there was a bunch of people who were actually opposed. I can tell where this is going. I can tell where this is going already by this last. I don't think we're going to get much out of it from AI here, unfortunately. But there was about 5 or 6 key bankers who were very opposed to a Federal Reserve. Like these people weren't stupid. I know we've had a Federal Reserve now for 100 years, but these guys knew the negative implications of having a centralized bank, a central bank. And so there's 5 or 6 pretty well-known businessmen who were very opposed to the creation of the Federal Reserve. And they were all conveniently on the Titanic that sank. So very influential business leaders in the US and probably from around the world, but mostly the US, I would say, I think. But they were all conveniently on the Titanic. And J.P. Morgan caught the flu right before he was supposed to load. I'm sure there was no coincidence there. I'm sure that was just, I'm sure he had a couple sniffles and he wanted to miss the most important voyage of all time. So that was the timeline there. And again, I'm not going to claim anything here. AI just told us that theory was debunked numerous times. So who am I to say? I'll let you do your own thinking. So that's what happened there. So then a year later, literally a year later, the Federal Reserve was created. Like they didn't even wait and just pretend like, you know, maybe it was a coincidence. They're like, yeah, they're gone. Let's get this thing fired up. Jekyll Island, let's go, boys. We're going to destroy society here. So 1921, that's when Henry Ford dreamt up an energy currency. 1933, the U.S. government, what happened there? The U.S. government started confiscating gold, making it illegal. I think it was 1934, the next year. They started confiscating gold, and then the next year, they made it illegal for for citizens to own gold. Why? And then 1971, of course, that's when we officially, even though it pretty much happened back here when citizens were no longer allowed to own gold. So that actually lasted 40 years where US citizens were not able to own gold. You know, they had to get their system going. So we officially depegged from gold and dollar becomes, what would you call it? Useless? No. Dollar becomes fake, pretty much. That's what happened there. So that was kind of the story there. And that's 1921. It kind of fits right in there. So again, if you think about how fast things happen, like even though it was 10 years between these three things happening, it goes by pretty fast. So again, Titanic hits the iceberg, Federal Reserve, a group of guys get together on Jekyll Island. They decide that they're going to start a central bank. They got a lot of very big backers, some from other parts of the world too. And that's where everything went downhill. And then in 1921, Henry Ford said, you know what, this is bullshit. We can't have this. We can't even have a currency that's backed by gold because it's too centralized. So Henry Ford in 1921 decided that even a currency that's backed by gold is too centralized, too risky. So he said, let's have an energy currency. It'll end wars because governments will not be able to print money to fund the wars. And then, of course, we know what happened from there. And then 1933, the U.S. started confiscating gold. And then, of course, 1940s, that's when World War II happened. And they didn't really need to. That was kind of the timeline there. So 1933, the U.S. government started confiscating gold. They made it illegal for citizens to own gold privately. 1940s, World War II happened. And basically what happened for the next 20, 30 years after the aftermath of World War II is that the U.S. government got caught with their pants down. All the other countries who had the U.S. dollar pegged to gold said, you know what, U.S., we're calling bullshit on you. We think that you printed more money than the gold reserves that you have. We want our gold back. And that's, of course, when 1971, when the U.S. panicked and said, you know what, we're just depegging from gold. We don't want to deal with this anymore. We're getting too much blowback here. So now we're just going to print money without anybody even caring about it. And that's how we've lived for the last 50 years. And I wish I could swear right now because that is absolutely insane that they were able to keep people in the dark for this long about it. I could say a lot of different things here. Number one, for myself personally, I went through the normal traditional school of high school, college. I was in business. University, I took my accounting and economics. And then, of course, I did my CPA. All about money, all kind of centered around money. And I had no idea what the currencies were backed by. None. So they were very effective in keeping this from people. My dad worked at a bank for 40 years. 40 years. And he didn't know really anything about this kind of stuff. I mean, he had an idea, but he didn't really know the implications of it. Somebody who spent 40 years working at a bank didn't know the full story behind the money. So they did a very good job of keeping this whole thing under wraps. And it's kind of my theory that something happened in 2015-ish that just broke society. I mean, the 2008 collapse was a pretty big one. Then, of course, that same year, coincidentally, the Bitcoin white paper was released. But it was 2015. That's when people really started to get wise on this kind of stuff. I know there was the protests against Wall Street back in 2007, 2008. But everything kind of broke wide open in 2015. I don't know what happened there, but something happened in 2015 where people got pretty wise to it. So anyway, some important numbers that we need to be thinking about today, because this is all going to tie together. So 210,000, that's the blocks between epochs. And I'm going to run some numbers here in just a sec. So that's the blocks between epochs. Again, Bitcoin doesn't work on human time. Bitcoin doesn't care that it's March 10th today. According to Bitcoin, it is about 940,000 and what, 60? That's the block height. That's the time in Bitcoin. 10 minutes between blocks. So this is the target. And this is why the energy currency works now, because we have the ability to have this target of 10 minutes and the difficulty adjustment that keeps that on track. So that's the main purpose of the difficulty adjustment, is to make sure that there's 10 minutes on average between blocks. And so what do I mean by that? I'll just maybe bring up the mempool here just to give you a visualization of what I'm talking about there. Oh, we're frozen. There we go. So these are the blocks, and I'm going to show a couple different things here as we kind of talk through this. But this is the block height. So I just mentioned there 940,000. This is the time in Bitcoin right now. This is the block height, 940,129. And that basically, that's the total number of blocks that have been mined since January 3rd, 2009, since the very first Genesis block. So there's been 940,129 blocks since then. And each block you can actually click into. You can click into and look at for yourself. You can see who mined it. You can see the timestamp of it. You can see the total fees that the miner received. You can see all the transactions that happen inside of this block. So this is the one constant you'll see on the Bitcoin time chain, is this Coinbase transaction. So again, this has nothing to do with the Coinbase company. This is the Coinbase transaction, the newly generated coins. The newly generated coins. So I want you to think about this for a second, because this is an important part to understand, which is that everybody knows that there's 21 million Bitcoin. That's kind of the max supply. And those 21 million Bitcoin were essentially, they've existed since the very first block, January 3rd, 2009. Those Bitcoin have existed. And so what happens is basically every 10 minutes, those Bitcoin are released or emitted to the miners. So over time. So basically, again, the 21 million, even though only 20 million have been mined, those 21 million Bitcoin have always been there. But it's just that every 10 minutes, they're emitted to the network. They're put into circulating supply, essentially. And that's what this Coinbase transaction does, is it sends the coins to the miner. Whoever mined the block, in this case, was Antpool. So Antpool got the newly generated coins here. So that's essentially how new Bitcoin are added to the supply, is every 10 minutes when there's a new block on average, the miner gets these newly generated coins. And then you can scroll down, you can see everything here. So everything's fully transparent on the Bitcoin ledger, essentially. And you can go back and verify this yourself. You can look at every single block here. So I'm actually going to go back to the beginning here, the beginning of Bitcoin. Block 0, the Genesis block. So Bitcoin from day one was launched fairly, because Satoshi Nakamoto was the only person mining when this block was mined. So he knew it was unfair. And so he mined the first block, which gave him 50 Bitcoin. For the first 210,000 blocks, every miner who mined a block got 50 Bitcoin, 50. And so Satoshi got that first coin. Here's the Coinbase transaction right here, the newly generated coins. And he put a little note in here that said, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. That's what he inscribed into the network, I guess, or he added as in the op return, I believe. So there it is. That's the very first transaction, or I guess the Coinbase transaction that happened back in 2009. So these coins went to Satoshi. He was the only one mining. And so what he did is he made these coins basically unspendable. So he burned the keys, made them unspendable by anybody, because he knew that he was the only one mining. And if this thing was going to succeed, it had to have been launched fairly, and it was. So the second block here happened, I believe, 6 days later. And again, 50 Bitcoin. That was the subsidy at the time. 50 Bitcoin. And then if we go to, so keep that number in mind there, 50. That's the subsidy here. 50 Bitcoin. Keep this in your mind right now. And then if we go back to the top here and we search block 211,000, the block subsidy for this one, so this will now be epoch number 2. And again, this is going to kind of make sense as we go forward here. But you can see that the subsidy now is 25 Bitcoin. Got cut in half. So every epoch, that subsidy gets cut in half. So it went from 50 to 25. And then if we look at block height of, what would it be? 40, we'll go 450,000. This subsidy should be 12.5. So it got cut in half again. So there it is. The newly generated coins, 13 Bitcoin. So 12.5 was where's the subsidy there? So the fees there were 0.8 of a Bitcoin or 80 million sats. And the subsidy was 12.5 for a total of 13.34 Bitcoin. So 13 Bitcoin back in, when was this? 2017. 13 Bitcoin cost 11,000 USD. That wasn't that long ago. 2017. January 2017. So 9 years ago, you could have got yourself 13 Bitcoin for 11,000 US dollars. So that's less than $1,000 per Bitcoin at the time. And so that's what the miners get. That's the miners' incentives for securing the network, is they get paid the subsidy plus the fees. So the subsidy is the fixed amount. So we talked about 50 and then 25 and then 12.5. That's the block subsidy. The miners also get the fees. So every time you send a Bitcoin transaction on the layer 1 network, the main net, you have to include a transaction fee. And that transaction fee goes to the miner. So that's part of their incentive as well. They get both the subsidy, which is the fixed amount, somewhat fixed, semi-fixed. It changes every 210,000 blocks, plus the transaction fees. So that's their incentive for mining. And if we look at quickly here, the hash rate here, and the hash rate essentially means that the total amount of energy going into the Bitcoin network here. So you can see that, for 3 months, it's pretty flat. 6 months, pretty flat. We had a big dip here for the winter storm in the US, where a bunch of the miners reallocated their energy from Bitcoin mining to heating homes, keeping people warm. So that's 6 months. If we look at a year, also pretty flat. 2 years, bit of an incline there. But if we look at this over time, this is the total hash rate in the Bitcoin network. So, you see a chart like this and you're thinking pretty positive. So again, this is the total amount of energy going into the Bitcoin network. So when somebody plugs a Bitcoin miner into the wall, this number goes up. When somebody unplugs a miner from the wall, this number goes down. So it's really that simple. I know in Bitcoin, there's a lot of different terminologies and technicalities and all these things, but that's the big picture. That's the average person way to think about it. It's just energy going into the network. So you can see pretty good sign here. And this is going to be pretty important here as well, because when we look at the hash rate here, so you can see that back in 2009, the hash rate of the Bitcoin network was 5 megahash per second. So again, that's the number of guesses essentially per second, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second. And then we went to gigahertz, or it's not gigahertz, gigahash per second. And then we went to terahash per second. And then we went to, no, not on the screen here. But basically back here, you could mine Bitcoin with a laptop. So if you're watching this show on a laptop, you could have mined Bitcoin with your laptop because there was just no competition. You would have had enough computational power from your laptop to mine Bitcoin. And that's how most people mine Bitcoin back here. But as more and more people got wise to what's going on here, they started mining and the competition went up. So you needed more energy to be able to have a chance at hitting a block. So then you see we went from terahash to petahash per second, and we kind of stayed there for a while. And then in 2019, I think it was, we went into exahash. Sorry, 2017, exahash. And we actually stayed in exahash for a decade. It wasn't until 2025 when we went into the zettahash territory. So you can see there the hash rate is 1 zettahash now, or it was. What's it today? 1.19 zettahash. March 5th, March 9th. So it's right around 1 zettahash right now. It's kind of been going up and down again. That storm in the US had a pretty big impact on the network because a lot of the miners had to power down so that energy could be used for heating homes. So that's the hash rate. That's the total energy going into the network. And you see that chart. This is my favorite chart in Bitcoin. And it just goes to show you that, things are pretty good. Contrary to what the fiat price will tell you, contrary to what the comments in the YouTube section will tell you, people think it's worth it to contribute their electricity to Bitcoin. And so again, the incentives for people mining Bitcoin are, if they hit a block, they get paid in Bitcoin. So if somebody hit a block today, they would earn themselves, what did the last block receive there for their trouble? They received the total fees of about 4 million sats, 4.9 million sats, and plus the subsidy. So they got 3.174 Bitcoin and pool. So they mined this last block and they got paid 3.174. So that's the incentive for mining, is you get paid in Bitcoin. The newly generated coins there, every block has the newly generated coins. Those go to the miner that mine the block. So that's their incentive. They get paid the subsidy, they get paid the fees, and those are the newly generated Bitcoin. So that's what miners have to figure out. They have to figure out, based on how much money I'm spending on electricity here, is it worth it for me to mine with the chance that I hit a block and get paid in Bitcoin? So it's a gamble. It's completely random. There's miners out there who have been contributing to the network, paying for electricity to mine Bitcoin, and some of them never hit a block. So that's the risk that you run, is you might never hit a block. But of course, when you think about it this way, the more energy you have going to the network, the greater odds you have. So let's make sure we understand that part of it, because that's a pretty important part here before we go any further. So basically what miners are doing, very big picture here, miners are guessing. That's what the miners do. The miners have a very specific job, is to produce hashes and try to guess the block equation. So miners are trying to guess the block equation. That's their sole purpose. They have these things in them called ASICs, which are very specialized chips that have one job: to try or to produce hashes that try to guess the block equation. And if a miner guesses the block equation, they get to mine the block. And so they don't just get paid, but another important component to this too is that they don't just get paid, they get to decide, and this is important if you think about like the big picture implications of this, they get to decide which transactions go into the next block. So that's pretty important. If you play this out a lot of years, and let's say that you had a government that had a lot of hash power and they were hitting a lot of blocks, and they were then deciding which transactions got put into the block. Or if there was another government mining Bitcoin and they were hitting a lot of blocks and they refused to put another government's transactions into their block, you could see the dynamics of this and why it's so important for governments and entities around the world to secure this hash power. Because if Bitcoin ends up being a global reserve currency, it's the miners who actually decide which transactions go into the next block. So they design what's called a block template and choose which transactions go into the block. And so the incentive here is the more computational power you have, the more guesses. We're just calling them guesses because that's pretty much what they are. These ASICs, these miners, basically that's their only job is to guess. And the more computational power you have, the more guesses you can make. And of course, the implications of that would be the more guesses you can make, the higher your odds of hitting a block. I should say mining a block. So that's the incentives there. If you want the best chance of hitting a block and getting paid, but also getting to decide which transactions go into that block, you want to have more odds. You want to have more guesses. And so what do? You get more computational power. You get better miners. You get more efficient miners. You get more miners, and you get more hash power. And so that's why Bitcoin is an energy currency, is because it takes physical energy, whether it's hydropower, solar power, nuclear power. It takes energy from the physical world and it brings it into the digital world. And there's nothing else exists on the internet that actually ties to the physical world other than Bitcoin. That's why altcoins are worthless. That's why most information you see online is worthless, because it's easy to copy and paste. It's easy to recreate and duplicate and just create something out of nothing. That's what the fiat dollar is too, but that's also why most cryptos have no real value, because they don't have any cost to produce. Bitcoin takes physical energy, brings it into the digital realm, and it costs money. It costs energy to create a Bitcoin. Or not create a Bitcoin, but to mine a Bitcoin, I should say. All the Bitcoin have already been created. All 21 million Bitcoin already exist. It's just that over the next 120 years, those Bitcoin are going to be paid out to the miners and put it into supply, essentially, based on who's mining and who hits the blocks and who gets to decide which transactions go into that block. So if we think about it this way too, like this is a good way to think about it. So if you look at the mempool here, this is a ledger of all the Bitcoin transactions here. And you can see the last block was 2 minutes ago by F2 pool. And so if you were to send a Bitcoin transaction right now, not on Lightning, not on your exchange, not just buying Bitcoin, but if you were to actually get my Bitcoin address and send me a Bitcoin transaction, the first place it goes is right over here to the mempool. So this little dotted line here, this is essentially when it goes from the mempool into a block. And so if I was sending a Bitcoin transaction right now, let's say that I was sending it to Sedge. So if I want to send Bitcoin to Sedge right now, I would get his address, I'd set my fee, and I'd want to set my fee to be at least like 2 sats per VByte right now. Because again, miners get to decide which transactions get put into the block. And so from a economic perspective, miners usually choose the transactions that have the highest fees, right? They want to maximize their revenue. It makes sense. So I would set my fee to be higher here. So then whoever mined the next block, they would see my transaction, they would see my fee that I'm paying, and they would include my transaction in the next block. So essentially, this is the next block to be mined here. And you send a Bitcoin transaction, it goes into the mempool first. And it stays there until a miner puts it into a block. So again, think about the game theory there, where if you had a country that had a significant amount of hash power and they were able to decide which transactions get put into a block and which ones don't, you could see why it's important to have hash power, to have the ability to put your transaction into a block. Because once it crosses this line here, it's there forever. Well, pretty much. I mean, there are certain things that could happen, I guess, that have happened. But pretty much as soon as your transaction crosses this line and gets put into a block, it's going to be there forever. And why is that? Just quickly, why is that? And you probably heard that Bitcoin's immutable. You've probably heard somebody say Bitcoin's immutable because once your transaction goes from the mempool and gets put into a block here, the new ledger, the new chain of blocks is updated, and that gets sent out to everybody in the network who's running a Bitcoin node. And so that gets broadcast to 25, 30, 35,000 people around the world who all now have a copy of this updated ledger with your transaction in it. And then, of course, another block comes, and then it's even further into the chain, even harder to make a change to. So that's why Bitcoin's immutable, because once it gets put into a block, it's there forever. That gets sent out to everybody running a node. And anybody who's running a node, basically, they're just keeping a copy of all the transactions that have ever happened in Bitcoin. That's really what it is. And you can verify that your transaction is legitimate if you run your own node, because you get an updated copy of the ledger approximately every 10 minutes, every time there's a new block. Or I guess even sooner than that, every time there's a new transaction put into the mempool, depending on what your mempool policy is. But this ledger, as soon as it crosses this line here, that gets sent out and broadcast to the whole network. So your transaction's in there. Okay, so if we go back to the spreadsheet here, the difficulty adjustment. So the difficulty is adjusted. And again, I'm kind of every 2016 block. So again, if we think about it this way, I'm going to make more space here. So if we think about the 210,000 blocks between epochs, so let's go like this, just quickly to show what this means. So epoch 1, 210,000 blocks, and the block subsidy was 50. So in the first epoch, the first 210,000 blocks, there was 10.5 million Bitcoin mined. 10.5 million Bitcoin mined. So if we go like this, 420,000, and then this should be 630. Okay, and then this is 50. So every epoch here, every 210,000 blocks, the subsidy, the payment to the miners, it gets cut in half. And that's what you probably heard the phrase Bitcoin halving before. That's what happens. So again, Bitcoin's not based on like every 4 years or every certain amount of months. It's based on the block height. So every 210,000 blocks. And this is where we are right now. We're in epoch number 5. And so you can see here, pretty quick math will tell us where we are right now. So after the first 4 epochs, a total of what? How come I can't see that? Equals sum of these ones. That's not right. Why'd that not work? That's not right either. Why is that wrong? Hold on. What's off with this? This should be half of this. Oh, that's why. Because, yeah, okay. It's taking the wrong number here. That's okay. We'll figure it out here. So we got 210. That's this what it should be. Times 25. So you can see that in the first 2 epochs here, 75% of the total supply was mined. In the first 2 epochs here, think about that. In the first 2 epochs here, 75% of the Bitcoin had been mined. And it's kind of cool that it actually lines up with the subsidy here. So 50 and 25, that's 75, right? And so then after the third epoch, it was actually 87.5. You can kind of do that math quickly there. 87.5. And then I don't know. I wish I could see this. I wish this doc thing would get out of my life. I can't see it. There we go. So what do we have here? 50, 25. So at the end of epoch number 5, which should be approximately May 2028, you can see that there will be 96.875 of the total Bitcoin mined? 96.875. So if we just go like this, because Michael Saylor said that basically in 2035, that's when 99% of the Bitcoin network will have been mined. So I think that'll be, we'll go like this. No. So that'll be at about 1.68 million block height. And if we keep cutting this in half, so look at that. In epoch number 8, the block rewards are going to go to 39 million sats per block. So they started at 50. Back in 2009, a miner got a block. They got 50 Bitcoin. In epoch number 8, which will be, let's put some years here. So this was 2009. This is 2012. This is 2016. This is 2020. This is 2024. Actually, no, I got to move these up. 2028, epoch number 6 begins. 2032, 2036, 2040. So I believe by the year 2040 or 2036, there'll be less than 1 Bitcoin every block. And so if we look at this, that's 99.6%. I don't know if you can see that down there very well, but that's 99.6. Oh, wow. 99.6% of the network will have been mined, of the Bitcoin will have been mined by 2040. 99.6. So why does this matter? Like, why are we talking about this today? It matters because when Henry Ford thought of this idea, I was going to do the epochs here. We can get rid of this now. So when Henry Ford had this idea in 1921, why wouldn't this have worked? I mean, there's a couple of reasons for it, but I think there's 2 main ones here. And so again, Henry Ford's idea was to be able to capture an energy currency, use electricity to create a new currency, which is pretty much what Bitcoin is. But the problem in 1921 is they didn't have the internet. And so they had no ability to store or transfer essentially electricity, because that's what it was. The currency, his idea was a currency that was backed by electricity. So in 1921, they didn't really have the ability to store or transfer electricity as a currency. They had the ability to measure it, but they didn't really have the ability to store and transfer it like we do with Bitcoin now. So there was a lot of different things in the last 100 years that evolved into Bitcoin, but it was all based on this concept of an energy currency from Henry Ford in 1921. So the other part of it too, and this is where the difficulty adjustment comes in, is that there was no ability to fix the supply, right? Because think about this. Think about where we are today, 2026, 100 years after Henry Ford thought of this idea. The technological advances. So if you had a currency that was truly backed by energy, what would happen there? As technology improved, our ability to harness and produce energy would also increase with it. And so therefore, as technology constantly gets better, we would be constantly increasing the supply of Bitcoin, or of units, I should say, not Bitcoin, but of units. Right? So as technology improves, we can create more energy. And that's what we're seeing now. We have so many different energy sources now. But the problem with that is that we would also be able to create infinite units of money, units of currency. So those were the 2 problems. Is that there's no ability to store or transfer electricity as a currency, and there's no ability to fix the supply. And so what happened here with Bitcoin and why Bitcoin works now, I'll maybe hold on to that idea for a second. So that's why it didn't work in 1921. Plus, I'm sure there was probably misunderstanding of why, misunderstanding of why it was needed. Why not just trust the banks? Federal Reserve's got our back. They seem like good people. They wear suits. Understanding of why it was important and how it could work. So again, I keep going back to this, but just think about that. Back in 1921, Henry Ford had enough foresight and vision to see that even gold, because gold, all the money was backed by gold at this point in history. 1921, the currency was still fully backed by gold. And even Henry Ford said, this isn't enough because gold centralizes. With gold, you have to trust somebody. That's a problem. And so he wanted this energy currency. And so I'm just going to quickly go through this because I think this is kind of fun to think about, but not overly important. But why would Bitcoin have failed before 2009? So number one, we had dial-up, right? So dial-up would not allow Bitcoin to be always on. Bitcoin needs to be always on. And back before 2009, we had dial-up. I don't know who remembers that around here, but it wasn't always on. If you got a phone call, your connection would cut off, and so it wasn't reliable. Two is the latency. Again, because it was much slower back then. This is an important one. So let me put this in bold actually. So for a decentralized currency to work, every computer in the network needs to agree on which transaction came first. Every computer in the network needs to agree which transaction came first, right? Because there's no centralized authority in Bitcoin. There's nobody that says, hey, this block actually came first or this transaction came first. Everybody has to be on the same page. Information has to be spread and dispersed timely, in a timely manner, so the network can stay intact. And that's actually why the 10-minute block time, if we go back to this, that's why this is so important. The 10 minutes between blocks, that's the target. Because then the network can all agree. The network can come to consensus that says this block came before this one, this transaction came before this one, because everybody can agree on it. There's 10 minutes for this to travel around the world and say, yep, that block's valid, next one. On average, it's not every 10 minutes, but on average. And so the latency was a big one. And we wouldn't have had the ability to do that before 2009. Storage was another one. 4 gigabytes was considered large back then. And so anybody who knows Bitcoin knows that you need a sufficient amount of storage. I believe it's like 700 gigabytes today to run a full node. Because again, when you're running a node, what are you doing? You're just keeping a copy of the ledger. That's all it is. You have your own copy of the 940,000 blocks and all the transactions that have ever happened. So that, of course, is data. So you need sufficient storage. And so it couldn't have been decentralized enough because storage was so expensive back then that people wouldn't have been able to run their own nodes. And then the last one here is CPU power. So the hash rate was so low, and this is important because the hash rate was so low, the computers were like, they were much different back then. It took a lot longer. They didn't have the same kind of processing and computational power as we have today. So hash rate was so low that powerful university or government computer, computer could have essentially hijacked the network, right? Because everybody had computers at home, I think, at this point before 2009. Not everybody, but a lot of people did. But they were much different. And universities and governments had more powerful computers. And so there's a bigger variance there between the home computer and some of these really powerful university/government computers. And so because of that, Bitcoin could have been captured because there was just such a large variance there between home computers and powerful ones that it could have been hijacked. So, and of course, the other thing too is that we had the 2008 financial crash. And then 2008, we also had the Bitcoin white paper. And then 2009, we had the first Bitcoin block mined, the Genesis block. And it was funny because Satoshi actually made reference to the financial crash in the very first block. We saw that today. The chancellor on the brink of second bailouts. So Satoshi basically said, hey, you guys clearly, this system's screwed. Here's something new for you to try out. A network, a currency that cannot be controlled, cannot be centralized, cannot be stopped, cannot be created out of thin air like your currency is. It requires proof of work. Again, taking physical energy and bringing it into the network through mining. So that's why Bitcoin works. And again, if we think about it this way, so if we go back to the main flaw here, the main flaw of the energy currency idea back in 1921 is that there's no ability to fix the supply. And so what the difficulty adjustment does, so why Bitcoin works now, well, you basically look at all these. You say, okay, well, we got quicker internet and we can basically leave Bitcoin. It needs to always be on and we can do that now. The latency, every computer in the network is fast enough now. We can all agree within 10 minutes that this block is valid and it came before this one. Storage, I mean, you can buy 2 terabytes worth of storage now for a couple $100. So it's gotten a lot cheaper, which means that average people can run their own nodes and verify transactions and support the network and have a vote in what direction the network goes to. And then computational power. So there's different efficiencies, there's different powers or different computational power, but it's not a huge variance. And different companies have different abilities and miners and all this kind of stuff, but it's much more decentralized now. There's no supercomputer that could essentially come onto the Bitcoin network now and get all of the blocks and decide which transactions go into the blocks. So Bitcoin checks all these boxes now. But the main reason is the difficulty adjustment. And why that is, why the difficulty adjustment is important here is because as technology improves, we can create more energy. So think about that. As technology improves, we have the ability to create more energy. And think about in 10 years from now, how much different energy sources we're going to be able to utilize because of technology. But because of the difficulty adjustment, we cannot create infinite units of currency because it's on the difficulty adjustment keeps the blocks coming in every 10 minutes. And so when we look out in the future and we say, okay, in 2100, the year 2100, there's going to be this much supply. It's because we can realistically and reliably count on the blocks coming in every 10 minutes because of this difficulty adjustment that happens every 2016 blocks. And so what that means is, like, if there's a bunch of power that comes onto the network and they're winning all the blocks because they have significantly more hash power, more guesses, better odds, they're winning a bunch of blocks and they're deciding which transactions get put into a block. In 2016 blocks, that could go on for a little while, but every 2016 blocks, the difficulty adjustment goes up or down. So if there was a bunch of energy coming onto the network, the difficulty adjustment would crank up and make it very difficult for that miner who had a bunch of energy. They can't get those blocks any sooner because the difficulty adjustment cranks up. So the target, the 10 minutes there, is incredibly important because of that. Because we have a reliable and predictable supply schedule. And it's fixed. It's fixed. And that was the big difference between the Henry Ford's idea, is that you couldn't fix it, right? So back then, if you had an energy currency, the more energy that you created, the more units that you'd have. So if you had a really powerful technology that had a lot of energy, you could essentially just create a bunch of units for yourself. But because of the difficulty adjustment, that doesn't happen. It kind of self-regulates the Bitcoin network. So I know that's a lot I know that's a lot. I know. And a couple things I'll say here before we wrap up, because I'm almost at an hour here for the lesson. Number one, just be patient with yourself. You know, some of these concepts are fairly hard to understand. It probably took me 2 or 3 or 4 years, and I'm not even claiming that I fully understand it. So if you're somebody who just got into Bitcoin in like 2025 or 2024, like, just take it easy. Like, it's a lot to wrap your head around here, mostly because it's just so different than the system that we have. And so be patient with yourself. It takes time. And I would consider rewatching this. Rewatch this, take notes, join the Bitcoin school. Because I talk about these kind of topics every single day. There's a new video on the Bitcoin school. And these are the kind of things I talk about in kind of smaller chunks, though. So it's like 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, much more digestible and consistent. So the videos are posted every day, different Bitcoin topics, 15 or 20 minutes long. And there's a lot of repetition. And that's the key to learning, is repetition. And different touch points, looking at it through a different angle. Because some things hit differently with different people based on your experience and your knowledge that you have. So again, I'm going to tell you this. This is a lot. Well, maybe not the last time, but join Bitcoin School, which is school.com. You can also join as a member on YouTube and get access to the videos. But I would suggest joining the school before March 15th. And whoever joins before then is going to be rewarded, I guess you'll say, because you're going to have access to all the courses I've ever done, plus the Bitcoin School, everything. It's all exclusive, all-inclusive access. And I'm going to change the tiers on March 15th. So it's going to cost more to get what you get today. So in the next 5 days, I guess, I might leave this till Saturday or Sunday, just so that whoever's watching the replay can see this. But again, you got a supportive community and network. And I don't want you to underestimate how powerful a network's going to be in the future here. If Bitcoin succeeds, that means we're going to be taking out a lot of middlemen. And when you don't have middlemen to steal from you and essentially keep both sides honest, you have to rely on each other. And so it's important to have a network. It's important to have a reputation and proof of work. That's what it is. So don't wait a couple of years till you're more comfortable and everything, and you think you can afford it. Do it today, because this is absolutely vital. Your reputation in the future in this new cyber economy is critical. I'm telling you. And I see signs of this every day. The people who started building their network, who've been putting in the work, are getting rewarded every day and are going to be rewarded much more in the future. So that's it. I said last week, I think it was episode number 57 and 60. If you watch those 2 episodes alone, you'd actually pay for your membership, basically. And I shared a video yesterday talking about something too that would actually, you could utilize the network, all the information that's in there, and actually start earning a side hustle, a side income, strictly by being a member of school. So again, it's going to change. We're going to make some changes March 15th in 5 days from now. So I would suggest, if you do want to join, get there before then. And that's it. That's pretty much what I got for you today. So again, that was a long one, but there's a lot to get through there. But anyways, let's bring this down. Bitcoin is beautiful. It really is. Like, it's beyond. That's why I'm convinced that It was either aliens or time traveler that created Bitcoin, just because it's so perfectly designed. Not just like the math behind it or the proof of work, but the actual human psychology and just everything that goes into it is just perfectly designed. And I really don't think that a human being is capable of designing this. So, anyways, I guess I'm still on the show here. So for everybody watching on Saturday, the replay, hope you have a great day. We're going to keep going here for the live show. But yeah, consider joining. I guess we'll close things off tomorrow officially. We'll change the tiers if you're watching this on Saturday. So get in there. I guarantee, and I forgot to mention this, but I'll bring it up here quickly because this is important. I want everybody to be aware of this. You have 100% guarantee by Jor, which means that in a month or 2 months or a year from now, you say, you know what, Jor, I paid you. I feel like I didn't get enough value from it. I want a refund. I will give you 100% back in Bitcoin. That's how confident I am that you're going to get way more value than you pay for by being a part of this community. 100%, no questions asked. At any point you email me and say, not worth it, not worth my time or money, I want a refund. 100%. I'll even pay you in Bitcoin. You paid in fiat, I'll pay you in Bitcoin. There's just so much in there. There's so much information in there, so much information that you really need to know, and so many great people that are part of that, supporting you and teaching each other and helping each other. And we're gonna have some big things coming in this community this year. And I want you to get in there before the 15th to have full access to it for a very, very reasonable price. So everybody watching the replay, I hope you have a great day today, and we'll talk to you on the next one. Bye-bye.